Hello, and welcome to today's story. My name is Philip, and I like to dive deep into scary Asian stories and cover them in my videos. If you have an interesting story you want me to cover, let me know in the comments. I always read all comments. For now, let's get into today's story, where we have a few terrifying stories to share. One of them is this story. There are roads along the coast of Nagasaki where drivers refuse to stop after dark. Not because of the cliffs or the narrow curves, but because of what walks there. The locals know her by the sound she makes, a wet, labored gurgling that carries farther than it should in the still night air. She appears without warning, standing just beyond the reach of headlights, her figure draped in a long veil that moves even when there is no wind. Those who have seen her say the veil is old, stained dark along the hem, and that beneath it, something is wrong. The few who came close enough to help, thinking she was injured or lost, describe the same thing, a faint metallic smell in the air, like rust mixed with seawater, and a sound that did not belong to any living person. When she lifts the veil, they say, there is no scream, only silence, because her jaw is gone, torn cleanly away, leaving only a blackened hollow and teeth that dangle from the upper gum like broken stones. The woman has been seen on the old coastal road that winds between the cliffs and the sea for more than 30 years, though some say the sightings go back much further. The road itself is narrow and poorly lit, used mostly by fishermen returning home late or truckers cutting through the hills to avoid the toll routes. During the day, it is unremarkable, just cracked asphalt and weeds pushing through the edges. But at night, it changes. The air grows heavy, the kind of stillness that makes you hold your breath without knowing why. Locals who grew up in the area speak of her in careful tones, as if saying too much might draw her attention. They call her the Jawless woman, though no one knows her real name or how she came to walk that road. What they do know is that she does not stay in one place. She drifts, appearing sometimes near the old fish market, sometimes by the stone steps that lead down to the water, and sometimes directly in the middle of the road where drivers have no choice but to stop or swerve. The first recorded incident that drew official attention happened in the late 1980s, when a delivery truck driver reported seeing a woman standing in the road near midnight. He slammed on the brakes, thinking she had been in an accident. When he got out to help, she turned toward him slowly, her movements stiff and unnatural, and that is when he heard the sound. A wet, rasping breath that seemed to come from her throat but had no shape, no rhythm. He said he felt his legs lock, his entire body refusing to move, as she tilted her head back and lifted the veil with both hands. He did not wait to see more. He got back in the truck and drove, his hands shaking so hard he could barely steer. When he reported it to the police the next morning, they found no evidence of anyone on the road, no footprints, no signs of injury. They told him it was probably fatigue, a hallucination brought on by long hours and poor sleep. But 2 weeks later, another driver reported the exact same thing. Same location, same description, same sound. Over the years, the reports piled up, each one nearly identical in detail. A veiled woman standing in or near the road, always alone, always at night. Drivers who stopped to help said she never spoke, never gestured, only stood there breathing in that horrible, gurgling way until they got close enough to see her face. Those who did see it described a nightmare, the lower half of her face missing entirely, the flesh dark and ragged as if it had been torn rather than cut, and the remaining teeth jutting upward like shattered glass. Some said her eyes were open but unfocused, staring past them into nothing. Others said she had no eyes at all, just hollow sockets that wept something thick and black. What made the sightings even more disturbing was what happened afterward. Several drivers who encountered her on the road reported accidents within hours, crashes that investigators could not explain. One man swerved off the cliffs and died on impact, his car found crumpled on the rocks below. Another drove headfirst into a guardrail at full speed, though the road was straight and visibility was clear. When police interviewed survivors, they all said the same thing, that after seeing her, they felt something in the car with them, a presence in the back seat, a coldness that made their skin prickle, and the faint smell of rust and brine. Some said they heard her breathing behind them, that wet, choking sound filling the car, and that when they looked in the rear-view mirror, they saw her sitting there, her head tilted forward, her veil hanging loose. One woman crashed her car into a tree after she said the figure in the back seat reached forward and touched her shoulder. She survived, but she never drove that road again. When asked why she did not call the police immediately, she said she could not, that her phone would not work, that the screen went black the moment the woman appeared. Others reported the same thing, a sudden failure of electronics, radios cutting to static, headlights flickering, engines stalling for no reason. The stories spread, and with them came theories. Some believed the woman had been murdered, her jaw removed as part of a brutal crime that was never solved. Others thought she had taken her own life, throwing herself from the cliffs in despair, her body battered by the rocks and the sea. There were whispers of old debts, of a woman who had been punished by her family for speaking out, her mouth destroyed as a warning to others. No records matched the description, no missing persons reports from the area fit timeline. But that did not stop people from searching. Local historians dug through old newspapers and death records, looking for any mention of a woman who had died under violent or mysterious circumstances along that stretch of coast. They found several possibilities: a suicide in 1972, a fishing accident in 1964, a domestic dispute that ended in a woman being hospitalized in the 50s, but none of them matched perfectly. The lack of a clear origin only made the legend stronger. Without a name or a confirmed story, the woman became something larger, a symbol of every unresolved tragedy that had ever occurred on that lonely road. Fishermen began leaving offerings near the old stone steps, small bundles of rice and incense meant to appease her spirit. Taxi drivers started refusing fares that required them to travel the coast road after 10 p.m. One driver even quit his job entirely after he picked up a fare late one night and saw a veiled figure standing in the road ahead. He swerved to avoid her, and when he looked back, she was gone. But his passenger, a businessman from out of town, was staring at the back window with wide, terrified eyes. The passenger said he saw her face pressed against the glass, her mouth open in a silent scream, her breath fogging the window from the outside, even though they were moving at 60 kilometers per hour. The sightings continued, sometimes weeks apart, sometimes several in a single night. In 2003, a young couple driving home from a wedding reported seeing the woman standing near the edge of the cliff, her back to the road. They slowed down, unsure if she was real or just a shadow, and that is when she turned. The man driving said her movement was too fast, too smooth, like she had been pulled by a string. She walked toward the car, her steps uneven and dragging, and he panicked and accelerated. As they sped away, his fiancée looked back and screamed. The woman was running, her arms hanging limp at her sides, her legs moving in a jerking, broken rhythm that should not have been able to keep pace with the car, but she did. She kept up with them for nearly a kilometer before she finally stopped, standing in the middle of the road as they disappeared around the bend. The couple did not stop driving until they reached the next town. They reported it to the police, but again, no evidence was found. No footprints, no signs of anyone on the road. The officers suggested they had seen a drunk or confused pedestrian, but the couple knew what they had seen. The woman's veil had lifted slightly as she ran, and beneath it they saw the ruin of her face, the gaping absence where her jaw should have been, and the dark, wet gleam of exposed bone and tissue. They left Nagasaki the next day and never returned. By 2010, the story had spread beyond the local community. Paranormal investigators began visiting the area, setting up cameras and recording equipment along the road, hoping to capture evidence of the Jawless woman. Most came away with nothing, just hours of empty footage and static-filled audio, but a few claimed to have recorded something. One group captured what they described as a figure moving in the distance, visible for only a few seconds before the camera malfunctioned. Another recorded an audio file that contained a faint, rhythmic gurgling sound that lasted for nearly a minute, though they could not identify the source. Skeptics dismissed the recordings as hoaxes or technical glitches, but those who lived in the area did not need proof. They knew she was real because they had seen her, or they knew someone who had, and that was enough. The most disturbing encounter happened in 2015, and it involved a local police officer named Takashi Nomura. Nomura had worked in the area for over a decade and had heard the stories countless times, but he had always dismissed them as folklore, the kind of ghost tales that every rural town seemed to have. That changed one night in late October when he was driving home after his shift. The road was empty, the sky overcast and threatening rain, and he was tired, ready to get home and sleep. As he rounded a curve near the old fish market, his headlights caught a figure standing on the shoulder of the road, motionless and facing away from him. He slowed down, assuming it was someone who needed help, and pulled over a few meters ahead. He got out of the car, calling out to ask if they were all right, but the figure did not respond. It just stood there, its back to him, draped in what looked like a long, dark veil. Nomura approached cautiously, his hand instinctively moving toward his radio, though he was not sure why. As he got closer, he noticed the smell, sharp and metallic, like old blood mixed with seawater. He stopped a few feet away and called out again, his voice firmer this time, but still, the figure did not move. Then, slowly, it began to turn. Nomura said later that the movement was wrong, that it did not turn like a person would, but instead rotated in place, its feet never shifting, its body simply pivoting as if on a fixed axis. When it faced him, he saw the veil, old and stained, and beneath it, a darkness that his mind could not process. The figure raised both hands and lifted the veil, and Nomura saw the ruin underneath, the absence of a jaw, the dangling teeth, the wet, glistening hollow where bone and flesh had been torn away. He heard the sound then, that terrible gurgling breath, and his body locked. He could not move, could not speak, could not even look away. The woman, or whatever she was, took a step toward him, then another, her movements slow and deliberate, and Nomura felt a coldness settle over him, a weight pressing down on his chest that made it hard to breathe. He does not remember how long he stood there, frozen and unable to move, but when he finally came to, he was back at his car, the engine still running, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles were white. The figure was gone. He drove home in silence, his mind struggling to make sense of what he had seen. And the next morning he filed a report, though he knew how it would sound. His colleagues did not believe him, at least not openly, but Nomura never drove that road again after dark. Since then, the sightings have continued, though less frequently than before. Some say the woman only appears during certain times of the year. Others believe she is drawn to specific people, those who are alone or vulnerable, those who carry grief or guilt. There are stories of drivers who encountered her and survived, only to be haunted by her afterward, seeing her reflection in windows, hearing her breath in the quiet of their homes, feeling her presence in the spaces where they should have been alone. One man claimed she followed him home, that he saw her standing outside his bedroom window every night for a week, her veil lifted, her ruined face staring at him through the glass. He moved to another city, but even there, he said he could still hear her, that wet, rasping sound that filled his ears when he tried to sleep. The authorities have stopped investigating the reports, chalking them up to urban legend and mass hysteria, but the people who live along that coast know better. They know the woman is real, that she walks the road at night, searching for something, or perhaps waiting for someone. They do not know what she wants, or why she lingers, but they know better than to stop when they see her. They drive past, eyes forward, hands steady on the wheel, and they do not look back, because those who do often see her standing in the road behind them, her veil lifted, her hollow face watching as they disappear into the dark. And sometimes, just sometimes, they feel the weight of her climb into the back seat, cold and silent, and they know that no matter how fast they drive, she will be there until she decides to leave. I hope you enjoyed these stories. Tomorrow, we will be uploading another terrifying story. Feel free to subscribe and put on your notifications to never miss another scary video. I upload almost every day. Wish you all the best. But as chilling as that story was, it is far from the only one. In another part of Asia, something equally disturbing took place. Though this time it was not along a lonely road or near the sea, but in the fields and villages of northern Thailand. Here, the horror came not from a woman in mourning, but from a child, small and barefoot, with a smile that hid something far worse than grief. What happened in those rice fields still haunts the people who witnessed it, and to this day they refuse to walk alone after sunset. In the outskirts of Chiang Mai, where the rice fields stretch wide and the villages grow quiet after dark, there is a story that parents tell their children, not as entertainment, but as a warning. They speak of a boy who appears near the abandoned fields after the sun has set, walking barefoot through the mud, his clothes old and torn, his face pale in the moonlight. He looks lost, confused, and those who see him often feel a pang of sympathy, a need to help. But the villagers know better. They know that the boy is not lost, that he is hunting, and that anyone who answers him never makes it home. The first reports of the boy appeared in the early 2000s, though some of the older residents claim the sightings go back much further, to a time when the fields were still worked by hand and the village had no electricity. The boy is always described the same way, small, perhaps 7 or 8 years old, with dark hair that hangs over his eyes and bare feet covered in mud. He moves slowly, almost aimlessly, as if he does not know where he is going, and when he sees someone, he stops and watches. Those who have encountered him say he does not blink, that his eyes are too wide, too focused, and that his expression never changes. He simply stares, waiting, until the person either runs or speaks to him. If they run, he disappears, fading into the darkness, as if he were never there. But if they speak, if they ask if he is all right or offer to help, he smiles, and when he smiles, they see his teeth. The boy's teeth are wrong, sharp and needle-like, crowded together in rows that seem too long for his mouth. Some say they look like the teeth of a fish. Others compare them to broken glass, jagged and uneven. But everyone agrees on one thing. They are not the teeth of a child. When he smiles, his lips pull back too far, exposing gums that are dark and slick, and the smell that comes from his mouth is overwhelming, rotten, and sickly sweet, like meat left out in the Sunday. Those who have seen the smile say it is the worst part, Worse than the teeth, worse than the smell, because the smile is too wide, too knowing, and it tells them that the boy understands exactly what he is doing. After the smile comes the question. He asks in a soft, polite voice, his head tilted slightly to one side, "Are you alone?" It is not a casual question, not a child's curiosity. It is a test, and the answer determines what happens next. Most people, sensing something deeply wrong, lie and say no, that their friends are nearby or their family is waiting. When they do, the boy's smile fades, and he turns and walks away, his footsteps silent despite the mud. But those who answer honestly, those who admit they are alone, see something else. The boy's eyes change, growing darker, more focused, and his body shifts, his shoulders hunching forward, his hands curling into claws. Then he moves, not walking, but crawling, his limbs bending at strange angles as he scuttles toward them with a speed that should not be possible. The first confirmed incident involving the boy happened in 2004, when a farmer named Somchai was walking home through the fields after working late. It was nearly midnight, and the path he took was narrow and overgrown, winding through the old rice paddies that had been left fallow for years. Somchai had walked that path 1,000 times and knew every twist and turn, but that night something was different. The air felt heavier, the silence more oppressive, and he found himself glancing over his shoulder more than once, though he could not say why. About halfway home, he saw the boy standing in the middle of the path, his small figure illuminated by the thin light of the moon. Somchai stopped, startled, and called out, asking if the boy was lost. The boy did not answer at first, just stood there, staring, and Somchai felt a chill run down his spine. He was about to turn back when the boy spoke, his voice soft and clear. "Are you alone?" Somchai hesitated, then nodded, saying yes. His family was at home, and he was walking back by himself. The boy smiled, and Somchai saw the teeth. He said later that his legs went weak, that he wanted to run but could not move, and that the boy's smile seemed to grow wider and wider until it looked like his face might split in half. Then the boy dropped all fours and began crawling toward him, his movements fast and insect-like, his fingers digging into the mud with each step. Somchai finally broke free of his paralysis and ran, stumbling through the field, his heart pounding so hard he thought it might burst. He did not stop until he reached his house, and even then he could hear the boy behind him, the wet slap of his hands and feet on the ground, the faint sound of his breathing. When Somchai looked back, the boy was gone, but the next morning he found footprints in the mud outside his door, small and bare, leading up to the threshold and then stopping abruptly, as if the boy had stood there for hours, waiting. Somchai's story spread quickly through the village, and others began coming forward with their own encounters. A woman named Niran said she had seen the boy near the old temple, standing among the trees, and that when she walked past, he had followed her, staying just out of reach, his footsteps matching hers exactly. She said she could hear him breathing, a wet, rattling sound that made her skin crawl, and that when she finally turned to confront him, he was smiling, his head tilted at an unnatural angle. She screamed, and he vanished, but she found muddy handprints on her back later that night, as if he had touched her without her knowing. Another man, a taxi driver named Precha, claimed he saw the boy standing on the side of the road near the edge of the village. He slowed down, thinking the boy needed help, and rolled down his window to ask where his parents were. The boy walked up to the car, his movements slow and deliberate, and leaned in close, his face inches from Precha's. He asked, "Are you alone?" And when Precha said no, that he had a passenger in the back, The boy's eyes flicked to the back seat, which was empty, and his smile widened. Preacher hit the gas and sped away, his hands shaking, and when he looked in the rearview mirror, he saw the boy standing in the middle of the road, waving. The most disturbing part of the encounters was what happened to the livestock. Farmers began finding their animals dead. Chickens, goats, even a water buffalo, all stripped to the bone overnight. The flesh was gone, torn away cleanly, and the bones were left scattered in a wide circle, as if something had dragged them around while feeding. The kills were always surrounded by small, muddy footprints, the same size and shape as the boy's, circling the remains over and over, in a pattern that made no sense. Veterinarians and animal control officers were called in to investigate, and they concluded that the deaths were caused by wild animals, perhaps a pack of feral dogs or a large predator that had wandered into the area. But the villagers knew better. Dogs did not leave footprints like that, and no animal they knew of could strip a buffalo to the bone in a single night. The boy's origins became the subject of intense speculation. Some believed he had been a real child once, a boy who had died in the fields decades ago, either from an accident or from starvation during one of the famines that had plagued the region in the past. They said he had been forgotten, left without a proper burial, and that his spirit had returned, twisted by hunger and loneliness into something monstrous. Others thought he was not a ghost at all, but a demon, a creature that had taken the shape of a child to lure people in, feeding on their fear and their flesh. Local monks were consulted, and they performed rituals to cleanse the fields, burning incense and chanting prayers meant to drive away malevolent spirits. For a while, the sightings stopped, and the villagers breathed easier, believing the boy had been banished. But then, a few months later, he reappeared, standing near the same abandoned rice paddies, his smile as wide and terrible as ever. The monks said the spirit was too strong, that it had been there too long and had grown too powerful to be removed by prayer alone. They warned the villagers to stay away from the fields after dark, to avoid walking alone, and to never, under any circumstances, answer the boy if he spoke to them. Most heeded the warning, but not everyone. In 2009, a teenager named Anand ignored the stories and ventured into the fields late one night on a dare. His friends waited at the edge of the village, watching as he walked into the darkness, his phone flashlight cutting through the gloom. They saw him stop about 100 meters in, his light swinging back and forth as if he were looking for something. And then they heard him shout. His voice was high and panicked, and before they could react, the light went out. They called his name, but there was no answer. One of them ran to get help, while the others stayed at the edge of the field too, scared to go in after him. When Anand's father and several other men arrived with flashlights and tools, they searched the field for hours, calling his name and combing through the mud. They found him just before dawn, lying in a shallow ditch near the center of the field. He was alive, but barely, his skin pale and clammy, his eyes wide and unfocused. He was covered in scratches, long, deep marks that ran down his arms and legs, and his clothes were torn. When they tried to move him, he started screaming, thrashing, and clawing at the air as if he were fighting something they could not see. They carried him back to the village and brought him to the local clinic, but the doctors could not find anything physically wrong with him beyond the scratches, which they said looked like they had been made by an animal, though the pattern was strange, too deliberate, too precise. Anand did not speak for 3 days. When he finally did, he told them what had happened. He said he had seen the boy, standing in the middle of the field, exactly where the others said he would be, and that he had laughed, thinking it was one of his friends playing a prank. He walked toward the boy, calling out, and the boy turned and smiled. Anand said the smile made him stop, that something about it was wrong, and that he tried to turn back, but his legs would not move. The boy asked him, "Are you alone?" And Anand, too frightened to lie, nodded. The boy's smile widened, and then he dropped to the ground and crawled toward him, moving so fast that Anand did not have time to react. He said the boy's hands were cold, impossibly cold, and that when they touched him, he felt his strength drain away, his body going limp as the boy climbed onto him, his sharp teeth snapping inches from his face. Anand closed his eyes and waited to die, but then he heard voices, his friends calling his name from the edge of the field, and the boy stopped. He leaned in close, his breath hot and rotten, and whispered something that Anand would not repeat, something that made him cry when he thought about it. Then the boy let go and disappeared, leaving Anand alone in the mud. After that, the sightings became less frequent, but they never stopped entirely. Every few months, someone would report seeing the boy, always in the same area, always after dark. He would appear near the abandoned fields or along the narrow paths that connected the villages, standing still and silent until someone approached. Those who saw him and walked away unharmed considered themselves lucky, but they all said the same thing, that they could feel him watching them as they left, that his presence lingered in the air like a stain, and that they never felt truly safe again. The boy never aged, never changed. He remained the same small, barefoot figure, with the too wide smile and the needle-like teeth, waiting in the darkness for the next person to answer his question. The villagers adapted, teaching their children to avoid the fields at night, to walk in groups, and to never, ever admit they were alone. But the fear remained, a constant presence that shaped their lives, and every time someone went missing, every time an animal was found stripped to the bone, they knew the boy had fed again. The authorities continued to dismiss the reports, calling them superstition and folklore. But those who lived there knew the truth. They knew the boy was real, that he hunted in the shadows, and that no amount of science or logic could explain what he was or why he remained. And so, they lived with it, the way people learn to live with any nightmare, by avoiding it when they could and praying they never had to face it alone. I hope you enjoyed these stories. Tomorrow we will be uploading another terrifying story. Feel free to subscribe and put on your notifications to never miss another scary video. I upload almost every day. Wish you all the best. And while these stories already seem unbelievable, what comes next takes horror to a darker and more mysterious level. Because in the next part, the things that begin as coincidences twist into something far more terrifying, where the line between the living and the dead becomes impossible to distinguish, and where the answers people seek only lead them deeper into the unknown. What you are about to hear will challenge everything you thought you understood about the supernatural, and leave you questioning whether some doors are better left unopened. In the sprawling streets of Quezon City, there stands an old Catholic infirmary that has not seen patients in decades. The building is gray and crumbling, its windows boarded shut, its doors chained from the outside. People walk past it quickly, their eyes averted, and children are warned never to go near it after dark. The reason is simple. The building is not empty. Inside those rotting halls, something moves, something that was once a woman in white, but is now bent and broken, crawling across the floors with a sound that echoes through the silence. Those who have heard it say it is unmistakable, the sharp, wet crack of bone snapping, followed by the scrape of fabric dragging over tile. The locals call her the spine-cracked sister, and they say that if you hear the sound behind you, you must never turn around, because once you see her face, she knows you, and she will not stop following until she finds you alone. The stories of the nun have been whispered for more than 40 years, and in all that time, the building has remained untouched, a monument to fear that no developer has dared to disturb. The infirmary was built in the early 1950s as a private care facility for nuns and clergy members who had fallen ill or been injured while working in the region. It was a quiet place, modest in size, with only 2 floors and a basement that housed a small morgue and storage for medical supplies. The building was run by a strict order of Catholic nuns, and the care they provided was said to be both compassionate and professional. For nearly 2 decades, the infirmary operated without incident, serving the community and maintaining a reputation for cleanliness and discretion. But in 1971, something happened that changed everything. A young nurse named Sister Carmela, who had only been working at the infirmary for a few months, was found dead at the bottom of a narrow service shaft that ran from the basement to the 2nd floor. The shaft was used to transport medical waste and linens, and it was not designed for people to use, yet somehow Sister Carmela had ended up inside it. Her body was discovered by another nun, who had gone down to the basement to retrieve supplies and heard a strange sound, a faint creaking noise coming from the shaft's access door. When she opened it, Sister Carmela's body tumbled out, twisted into a shape that did not seem possible. Her spine was bent at a sharp right angle, her torso folded nearly in half, and her legs were twisted beneath her, in a way that suggested they had been broken and forced into position. The sight was so horrific that the nun who found her fainted, and when she came to, she could not speak for 3 days. The authorities were called, and an investigation was launched, but the findings were inconclusive. The official report stated that Sister Carmela had fallen into the shaft, though how she had accessed it remained unclear, and that the impact had caused catastrophic damage to her body. But those who saw the body, including the coroner and several police officers, said privately that the injuries did not match a simple fall. The degree of twisting and compression was far beyond what gravity and impact could cause, and the positioning of her limbs suggested she had been alive, at least briefly after the injuries occurred. There were no signs of foul play, no bruises or defensive wounds, but the case left everyone involved deeply unsettled. Sister Carmela was buried quietly, and the infirmary continued to operate, though the nuns who worked there reported feeling uneasy, especially near the basement. The first sighting of the spine-cracked sister occurred only a few months after Sister Carmela's death. A night nurse named Sister Beatriz was making her rounds on the 2nd floor when she heard a sound coming from the hallway behind her, a slow, rhythmic scraping, like fabric being dragged across the floor. She turned, expecting to see another nun, or perhaps a patient who had wandered out of bed, but the hallway was empty. The sound continued, growing louder, and Sister Beatriz felt a chill settle over her. She called out, asking if anyone was there, but received no answer. Then she heard it, a sharp, wet crack, like a branch snapping in half, followed by another and another. The sound was coming closer, moving toward her with a steady, deliberate rhythm. Sister Beatriz backed away, her heart pounding, and as she did, she saw a figure emerge from the shadows at the far end of the hall. It was a woman in a white habit, crawling on her hands and knees, but her back was bent at an impossible angle, folded nearly in half so that her head hung low, almost touching the floor. Her movements were smooth and unnervingly fast, her hands slapping against the tile with each step, and every time she turned her head, there was that terrible cracking sound, as if her spine were breaking and resetting with each motion. Sister Beatriz screamed and ran, fleeing down the stairs and out of the building, and she did not return. When she told the other nuns what she had seen, they dismissed it as exhaustion or stress, but within weeks, others began reporting similar encounters. A maintenance worker saw the figure crawling across the basement floor, her head twisted at an unnatural angle, staring at him with eyes that were wide and unblinking. A visiting priest claimed he heard the cracking sound coming from the chapel and saw a shadow moving along the wall, bent and distorted, before it disappeared. The sightings became so frequent that several nuns requested transfers, and by 1973, the infirmary was struggling to maintain its staff. The situation worsened when patients began reporting encounters as well. An elderly priest recovering from surgery said he woke in the middle of the night to find a woman in white standing at the foot of his bed, her back bent so severely that her face was level with his, staring at him from only inches away. He said she did not move, did not breathe, she just stared, and when he tried to scream, no sound came out. The next morning, he checked himself out and refused to return. A young nun who had been admitted after a car accident claimed that she saw the figure crawling across the ceiling of her room, moving in that same smooth, insect-like way, her head swiveling to track the nun's movements. She said the figure's mouth was open, as if she were trying to speak, but no sound came out, only a faint, rasping wheeze. The encounters were not limited to the interior of the building. Neighbors living near the infirmary began reporting strange sights as well. A figure in white crawling across the roof at night, her silhouette sharp against the moonlight, or pressed against the windows, her face distorted by the glass. One woman said she saw the figure standing in the alley beside the building, her back bent at that horrible angle, and that when their eyes met, the figure smiled, a slow, deliberate expression that made the woman feel physically ill. She moved out of the neighborhood a week later. By 1975, the infirmary was nearly deserted, with only a skeleton crew of nuns remaining, and they worked in shifts, refusing to be in the building alone. The decision to close the facility came in 1976, after a final incident that left no room for doubt. A janitor named Ernesto was cleaning the second-floor hallway late one evening when he heard footsteps behind him. He turned and saw the figure, crawling toward him with that bent, broken posture, her head tilted up to look at him, her eyes wide and glassy. Ernesto froze, unable to move, and the figure crawled closer and closer until she was only a few feet away. Then she stopped, her head tilting to one side, and there was a loud, wet crack as her spine twisted even further, her torso folding nearly flat against her legs. Ernesto said later that he could see her face clearly in that moment, pale and hollow, her expression one of silent agony, and that her lips moved as if she were trying to speak, but all he heard was the sound of her spine cracking, over and over, like a drumbeat. He ran, abandoning his tools and never returning, and the nuns decided that same week to shut the infirmary down permanently. The building was locked and boarded up, and for a time, it seemed that the story would end there. But the sightings did not stop. Even with the building closed, people reported seeing the figure inside, crawling across the floors, her shadow visible through the cracks in the boarded windows. Some claimed to hear the cracking sound from outside, echoing through the walls, and others said they saw her on the roof, moving in slow circles, as if searching for a way out. Urban explorers and paranormal investigators occasionally broke into the building, drawn by the stories, and most came away with nothing but dust and decay. A few, however, reported experiences that matched the older accounts. One group of teenagers who snuck inside in the early 2000s claimed they heard footsteps on the floor above them, followed by the sound of something heavy dragging across the ground. They went upstairs to investigate and found long scratches on the floor, deep grooves that looked like they had been made by fingernails. Another investigator, a man who ran a ghost hunting website, set up cameras in the building overnight and captured what he described as a shadow moving across the second-floor hallway, low to the ground and moving with an unnatural speed. The footage was grainy and inconclusive, but he said he heard the cracking sound on the audio recording, loud and clear, repeated over and over in a steady rhythm. He left the building before dawn and said he would never go back. The most disturbing aspect of the spine-cracked sister's legend is what happens to those who see her face. According to the stories, anyone who looks directly at her, who meets her gaze while she is crawling toward them, becomes marked. They report feeling watched in the days and weeks that follow, hearing the cracking sound in their homes, in their workplaces, even in crowded public spaces where no one else seems to notice. Some say they see her reflection in mirrors or windows, always behind them, always crawling closer. One man who claimed to have seen her in the infirmary said that for months afterward he would hear the sound of her movement in his apartment at night, the scrape of fabric and the crack of bone, and that he would wake to find scratches on his walls and floor, long, deep marks that had not been there before. He eventually moved to another city, but even there, he said the sounds followed him, quieter but still present, a reminder that she had not forgotten. Another woman who explored the building with friends said she felt a cold hand touch her shoulder while they were on the second floor, and when she turned, she saw the figure's face inches from her own, the eyes wide and unblinking, the mouth open in a silent scream. She ran, but for weeks afterward, she could not shake the feeling that she was being followed, that something was always just behind her, waiting. She began sleeping with the lights on, and eventually stopped leaving her house unless absolutely necessary. Her friends said she became paranoid and withdrawn, and when they pressed her for details, she would only say that she should never have looked back. The stories have persisted for decades, and the infirmary remains abandoned, a place that no one dares to enter for long. The city has considered demolishing it several times, but each time the plans are drawn up, something goes wrong. Accidents on site, workers refusing to continue, unexplained delays that stretch on for months. Some say the building is cursed, that Sister Carmela's spirit is bound to it, unable to move on, trapped in an endless loop of suffering. Others believe she is searching for something or someone, and that she will not rest until she finds it. The truth, if there is one, remains buried in the past, in the incomplete investigation and the unanswered questions about how she died. What is known is that the building is not safe, not because of its structural decay, but because of what moves inside it. The spine-cracked sister crawls through those halls still, her back bent at that terrible angle, her spine cracking with every turn of her head, and those who hear the sound know to run, because if they turn around, if they meet her gaze, she will follow them home, and once she knows you, she never stops. The infirmary stands silent now, its windows dark, its doors chained, but at night, if you listen closely, you can hear it, the faint, rhythmic crack of bone echoing through the empty halls, a sound that reminds everyone who hears it that some places are better left abandoned and some doors are better left unopened. I hope you enjoyed these stories. Tomorrow we will be uploading another terrifying story. Feel free to subscribe and put on your notifications to never miss another scary video. I upload almost every day. Wish you all the best. But as chilling as that story was, it is far from the only one. In another part of Asia, something equally disturbing took place, though this time it was not in an abandoned hospital or a lonely field, but in a place meant for celebration and joy. In the bustling city of Busan, South Korea, a wedding, the hall became the site of terror, where brides preparing for the happiest day of their lives encountered something that should not exist, a woman in white whose lips had been sewn shut, and whose presence brought nothing but dread and disappearance. The wedding hall in Busan was once one of the most sought-after venues in the city, a beautiful three-story building with high ceilings, crystal chandeliers, and large windows that overlooked the harbor. It was the kind of place where every bride dreamed of holding her ceremony, elegant and modern, with dressing rooms lined with mirrors and soft lighting that made everyone look their best. The hall hosted dozens of weddings each year, and for a long time, everything was perfect. Then, in the late 1990s, brides began reporting something strange. They would be sitting in the dressing room, preparing for the ceremony, surrounded by family and friends, when they would see something in the mirror, a figure standing behind them, just out of focus. At first, they thought it was another guest or a member of the staff, but when they turned around, no one was there. The figure would appear again moments later, clearer this time, a woman in a white gown, her dress torn and stained, her hair hanging in wet, tangled clumps around her face. But the worst part, the part that made every bride who saw her go cold, was her mouth. Her lips were stitched shut, the threads black and crude, sinking deep into the flesh, pulling the skin tight in a way that looked agonizing. The woman did not move, did not speak. She just stood there, her head tilted slightly, her eyes fixed on the bride's reflection. And then, after a few seconds, she would fade, leaving nothing but the faint smell of something rotting. The wedding hall had been in operation since the early 1980s, and in all that time, it had built a reputation for quality and professionalism. The staff were well-trained, the facilities were immaculate, and the management prided itself on creating perfect experiences for every couple who walked through the doors. But the reports of the stitch-mouthed bride, as she came to be known, began to damage that reputation. At first, the management dismissed the sightings as pre-wedding jitters or stress-induced hallucinations. Weddings were stressful events, and it was not uncommon for brides to feel overwhelmed or anxious in the hours leading up to the ceremony. But the reports kept coming, and they were too consistent to ignore. Brides from different families, different backgrounds, all described the same figure, the same white gown, the same stitched mouth. Some said they saw her only once, a brief glimpse in the mirror that left them shaken but willing to continue. Others said she appeared multiple times throughout the day, growing clearer and more distinct with each sighting, until they could see every detail, the threads digging into her lips, the dark hollows of her eyes, the way her dress seemed to move even though there was no wind. One bride became so distressed that she canceled the ceremony entirely, refusing to set foot in the building again. She told her family and friends that the woman in the mirror had been staring at her with an expression of such profound sadness and anger that she could not bear it, and that when she tried to look away, the woman's reflection moved closer, pressing up against the glass as if trying to break through. The first time the staff took the report seriously was in 2002, when a bride named Ji-yoon saw the figure and fainted. She had been alone in the dressing room, adjusting her veil, when she saw the woman in the mirror, standing directly behind her. Ji-yoon said later that the woman's face was pale, almost gray, and that the stitches in her mouth were so tight that the skin around them had started to tear, leaving dark, wet streaks down her chin. Ji-yoon turned around, thinking someone had entered the room, but it was empty. When she looked back at the mirror, the woman was closer, her face now filling the entire reflection, and Ji-yoon could see her eyes, wide and desperate, filled with a pain that seemed endless. Ji-yoon screamed and stumbled backward, hitting her head on the corner of a table and losing consciousness. When the staff found her, she was pale and shaking, and she refused to explain what had happened. Her family insisted on moving the ceremony to a different venue, and Ji-yoon left Busan entirely shortly after, telling her friends that she could still see the woman's face in every reflective surface, that the image had burned itself into her mind and would not leave. After that incident, the wedding hall's management hired a shaman to perform a cleansing ritual, burning incense and chanting prayers meant to drive away malevolent spirits. For a few months, the sightings stopped, and the staff breathed a sigh of relief, believing the problem had been solved. But then the woman returned, and this time, she was not alone in the mirrors. Staff members began reporting their own encounters. A makeup artist named Haijin said she was working late one evening, cleaning the dressing rooms after a ceremony, when she heard the sound of fabric dragging across the floor. She looked up and saw a figure standing in the hallway, a woman in a white dress, her head bowed, her hair covering her face. Haijin called out, asking if she could help, but the figure did not respond. It just stood there, swaying slightly, and then it began to move, not walking, but gliding, its feet never touching the ground. Haijin backed into the dressing room and locked the door, her hands shaking, and she stayed there for over an hour, listening to the sound of the dragging fabric moving back and forth in the hallway outside. When she finally opened the door, the figure was gone, but the hallway was freezing cold, and there was a wet trail on the floor, as if something had been dragged through water. Another employee, a security guard named Sung Min, said he saw the woman standing in the main hall late at night, her back to him, her dress torn and filthy. He approached her, thinking she was a guest who had stayed behind, but when he got close, she turned, and he saw her face, or what was left of it. Her mouth was stitched shut, the threads so tight that her lips had split in places, and her eyes were hollow, empty sockets that seemed to stare straight through him. Sung Min said he felt a wave of cold wash over him, so intense that he could see his breath, and then the woman vanished, leaving him alone in the empty hall. He quit the next day and refused to explain why. The legend of the stitch-mouthed bride began to spread beyond the wedding hall, becoming a story that brides across Busan whispered about in the weeks leading up to their ceremonies. Some said the woman had been a real bride once, a woman who was set to marry at the hall decades ago, but something had gone terribly wrong. The most common version of the story claimed that the bride had discovered on the morning of her wedding that her fiancé had been unfaithful, carrying on an affair with someone she trusted. Devastated and humiliated, she confronted him, threatening to call off the ceremony and expose his betrayal. According to the legend, the fiancé and his family could not allow the scandal, and so they silenced her, stitching her mouth shut to ensure she could never speak the truth. Some versions said she was killed and her body hidden. Others claimed she took her own life in the dressing room, unable to bear the weight of her betrayal and powerlessness. No records exist to confirm the story, no missing persons reports or death certificates that match the timeline, but the tale persisted, growing darker and more detailed with each retelling. Paranormal investigators who visited the hall said they felt an overwhelming sense of sadness and anger in the dressing rooms, and some claimed to have recorded electronic voice phenomena, faint whispers and sobs that seemed to come from nowhere. One investigator said she captured a photograph that showed a blurred figure in the background, wearing a white dress, though the image was too unclear to be considered definitive proof. The most disturbing aspect of the stitch-mouthed bride's appearances was the pattern that emerged over time. The figure did not appear to every bride, only to certain ones, and the common thread seemed to be doubt. Brides who were uncertain about their marriages, who had reservations or fears they had not voiced, were the ones who saw her most often. Some said they had been having second thoughts about their partners, worried about rushing into marriage or ignoring red flags in the relationship. Others admitted they had discovered troubling information about their fiancés, small lies or inconsistencies that made them question their trust. The bride in the mirror seemed to know, to sense, their uncertainty, and her appearances were more frequent and more intense for those women. One bride, who asked to remain anonymous, said she saw the woman in the mirror 3 times on the day of her wedding, each time closer and more distinct, and that by the 3rd sighting, she could see the woman's mouth moving beneath the stitches, as if she were trying to speak, trying to warn her. The bride went through with the ceremony, but she said she regretted it, that her marriage ended in divorce within 2 years, and that she often thought about the woman in the mirror, wondering if she had been trying to save her from making a mistake. Another bride said she saw the woman and immediately called off her wedding, telling her family that she could not go through with it, that something was deeply wrong. Her fiancé was furious, her family was shocked, but she stood firm, and months later she discovered that her fiancé had been hiding significant debts and had planned to use her family's money to pay them off. She said she believed the woman in the mirror had saved her, that the stitched mouth was a symbol of the silence and suppression she would have faced in that marriage. The wedding hall tried to suppress the stories, fearing that the rumors would drive away business. But word spread quickly, and by the mid-2000s, bookings had dropped significantly. Couples who did choose to hold their ceremonies there often requested different dressing rooms, avoiding the ones where the sightings had been most frequent, and some brides refused to look in the mirrors at all, asking their makeup artists to work without them. The management considered closing the hall permanently, but the financial investment was too great, and they held on, hoping that time would allow the stories to fade. Then, in 2007, something happened that forced them to shut down. A bride named Min Seo was preparing for her ceremony when she saw the woman in the mirror, standing so close that their faces were almost touching. Min Seo said the woman's eyes were pleading, desperate, and that she could see the stitches in her mouth moving, the threads pulling tighter and tighter until the skin began to tear. Min Seo screamed and ran from the room, and when the staff found her, she was hysterical, refusing to go back inside. The ceremony was canceled, and Min Seo left the hall, but she never made it home. Her family reported her missing that evening, and despite extensive searches, she was never found. Her car was discovered parked near the harbor, the doors locked, her belongings inside, but there was no sign of her. Some said she had taken her own life, overwhelmed by whatever she had seen, while others believed she had simply run away, unable to face her life after the encounter. But the locals whispered a different theory, that the stitch-mouthed bride had taken her, that Min Seo had seen too much, looked too closely, and that the woman in the mirror had pulled her through, trapping her in whatever dark space existed behind the glass. After Min Seo's disappearance, the wedding hall closed its doors permanently. The building stood empty for years, its windows dark, its once beautiful interior left to decay. Vandals broke in occasionally, leaving graffiti on the walls, but none of them stayed long. They reported feeling watched, hearing the sound of fabric dragging across the floor, and seeing shadows move in the mirrors even when no one else was there. One group of teenagers who explored the building said they found the dressing room where most of the sightings had occurred, and that when they looked in the mirror, they saw not their own reflections, but the face of a woman with stitched lips, staring back at them with eyes full of rage. They ran, and none of them ever returned. The building was eventually demolished in 2015, torn down to make way for a new development, but the stories did not end. Brides across Busan still report seeing the stitch-mouthed woman in mirrors, not just in wedding halls, but in their homes, in shops, in any reflective surface where they are alone and vulnerable. She appears to those who doubt, to those who are afraid, and her message, if there is one, remains unclear. Some believe she is a warning, a spirit trying to save women from the same fate she suffered. Others think she is vengeful, angry at those who have the freedom to choose, the voice to speak, the power to say no. Whatever the truth, the stitch-mouthed bride remains a fixture of Busan's urban legends, a ghost who refuses to be forgotten, and whose presence serves as a reminder that some silences are never broken, and some wounds never heal. I hope you enjoyed these stories. Tomorrow we will be uploading another terrifying story. Feel free to subscribe and put on your notifications to never miss another scary video. I upload almost every day. Wish you all the best. The last two stories are different. They are quieter, but far more disturbing. The kind that stay with you long after the telling ends. What you have heard so far has been visceral, visible, encounters with figures that crawl and stare and chase. But what comes next is more subtle, more insidious, because the horror in these final stories is not something you can run from or turn away from. It is woven into the fabric of everyday life, hidden in plain sight, waiting for the moment when you are vulnerable enough to notice it. These are the stories that make you question your own reality, that linger in the back of your mind when you are alone, and that remind you that sometimes the most terrifying things are the ones that never announce themselves at all. In the ancient temples of Kyoto, where incense smoke curls through centuries-old beams and tourists walk reverently through gardens of stone and moss, there is a figure that appears without warning, standing among the altars as if he has always been there. He wears the traditional robes of a Buddhist priest, dark and simple, and his posture is one of deep meditation, his head bowed low, his hands clasped before him. Visitors often mistake him for a monk in prayer and walk past quietly, not wanting to disturb his devotion. But those who stop, who linger too long, or approach to ask a question, discover something that defies explanation. When the figure lifts his head, there is no face beneath the hood of his robe, only a hollow void, a darkness so complete that it seems to swallow the light around it. Those who have seen it say the emptiness is not simply the absence of features, but a presence in itself, something that watches from within the blackness, something that knows you are there. Tourists who stared too long have collapsed, their bodies seizing uncontrollably, and when they come to, they speak of whispers, soft voices emerging from the void, urging them to look deeper, to lean closer, to understand. The monks who tend the temple deny that anyone has ever died on the grounds, and they dismiss the sightings as tricks of light or overactive imaginations. But late-night security footage tells a different story, capturing a figure that moves through the halls without casting a single shadow, a shape that exists in defiance of every natural law. The temple, where the hollow-faced priest appears, is one of Kyoto's oldest, a sprawling complex that dates back to the 8th century. It has survived wars, fires, and earthquakes, standing as a testament to resilience and faith. The temple is a popular destination for tourists and pilgrims alike, drawn by its beauty and its history, and on any given day, hundreds of people pass through its gates, lighting incense, offering prayers, and wandering the gardens in quiet contemplation. The temple's monks are known for their hospitality and their dedication to preserving the traditions of their order, and they take great pride in maintaining the sacred spaces entrusted to their care. But, despite their efforts, there is one part of the temple that feels different, a section near the main altar where the air is always colder, the silence more oppressive. Visitors often report feeling uneasy there, as if they are being watched, and some say they experience a strange pressure in their chests, a heaviness that makes it difficult to breathe. The monks do not speak of it openly, but among themselves, They acknowledged that the area has always been troubling, a place where prayers seem to echo differently, and where the incense smoke moves in patterns that do not follow the wind. The first recorded sighting of the hollow-faced priest occurred in the early 1990s, when a group of European tourists reported seeing a monk standing near the incense altar. His head bowed so low that his face was hidden. One of the tourists, a woman from Germany, approached him to ask about the temple's history, but when she spoke, the figure did not respond. She moved closer, thinking he had not heard her, and that is when he lifted his head. She said later that what she saw was not a face, but a void, a blackness so deep that it seemed to pull at her, drawing her in. She felt dizzy, disoriented, and her vision began to blur. Her companions rushed to her side as she collapsed, and when they looked for the monk, he was gone. The woman recovered after a few minutes, but she was shaken, insisting that the figure had not been human, that there was something wrong with the space where his face should have been. The monks dismissed her account as a fainting spell brought on by the heat and the altitude, but other reports soon followed. A Japanese student visiting the temple with his class said he saw the same figure standing in the shadows near the altar, and when the figure turned toward him, he felt an overwhelming sense of dread, a fear so visceral that he ran from the building without explanation. His teacher found him outside, pale and trembling, and he refused to go back inside. When asked what he had seen, he said only that the monk had no face, that where his features should have been, there was nothing, just darkness. Another visitor, an elderly woman from Osaka, claimed she saw the priest standing in the corner of the main hall, his robes perfectly still despite the draft that moved through the room. She watched him for several minutes, waiting for him to move or acknowledge her presence. But he remained motionless, his head bowed. Curiosity overcame her caution, and she walked toward him, calling out softly. The figure lifted his head, and she saw the hollow, and in that moment she heard a voice, faint and layered, as if multiple people were speaking at once. The voice said, "Look deeper," and she felt herself leaning forward, compelled by something she could not name. Her husband grabbed her arm and pulled her back, breaking the spell, and they left the temple immediately. She said later that she could not shake the feeling that if she had looked deeper, if she had leaned just a bit closer, she would have fallen into the void and never come back. The frequency of the sightings increased over the years, and the temple began to take the reports more seriously. The monks conducted several purification rituals, chanting sutras and burning sacred herbs meant to cleanse the space of negative energy. But the figure continued to appear, always in the same area, always with that hollow, featureless face. The most disturbing incident occurred in 2008, when a young woman named Akiko visited the temple alone. She was an art student, interested in traditional architecture, and she had come to sketch the interior of the main hall. It was late afternoon, and the temple was nearly empty, the last of the day's visitors having already left. Akiko set up her sketchbook near the incense altar and began to draw, losing herself in the details of the wooden beams and the soft light filtering through the paper screens. She did not notice the figure at first, did not see him standing only a few meters away, his head bowed, his hands clasped. It was only when she looked up to study the altar more closely that she saw him, and at first she assumed he was one of the monks. She smiled and nodded respectfully, then returned to her drawing. But something about the figure bothered her, a stillness that felt unnatural, a presence that seemed to absorb the space around it. She glanced up again, and this time she noticed that he was not breathing, that his chest did not rise or fall, and that his robes hung perfectly still, as if he were a statue. Unease crept over her, and she stood, intending to leave. But as she gathered her things, the figure moved. It was a slow, deliberate motion, his head lifting inch by inch, and Akiko felt her breath catch in her throat. She wanted to look away, to run, but her body refused to obey. The figure's face, or the place where his face should have been, came into view, and Akiko saw the hollow, a darkness that seemed infinite, and from within it she heard whispers, dozens of voices speaking in a language she did not understand, overlapping and urgent. The voices grew louder, more insistent, and one phrase repeated over and over, "Look deeper, look deeper." Akiko felt herself leaning forward, her mind clouding, and she took a step toward the figure, then another. She said later that she felt as if she were falling, that the void was pulling her in, and that she could see shapes moving within the darkness, figures writhing and reaching toward her. Then, without warning, the spell broke. A monk entered the hall, calling out to announce that the temple was closing, and the sound of his voice snapped Akiko back to herself. She gasped and stumbled backward, and when she looked again, the figure was gone. The monk found her sitting on the floor, her face pale, her hands shaking, and he helped her to her feet, asking if she was all right. Akiko could not speak, could only nod, and she left the temple as quickly as she could. That night, she experienced a seizure, collapsing in her apartment, and waking hours later with no memory of what had happened. She was hospitalized, and doctors ran tests, but they could find no physical cause for the episode. Akiko told them about the figure in the temple, about the hollow face and the whispers, and the doctors attributed her experience to stress and exhaustion. But Akiko knew better. She said she could still hear the voices sometimes, faint and distant, urging her to return, to look deeper, and that she avoided reflective surfaces and dark spaces, afraid that she might see the void again, staring back at her. The temple installed security cameras after Akiko's incident, hoping to capture evidence of what was happening and to reassure visitors that the space was safe. The footage they recorded was unsettling. On multiple occasions, the cameras captured a figure moving through the main hall late at night, long after the temple had closed and the monks had retired. The figure walked slowly, deliberately, its movements smooth and unhurried, and it wore the robes of a priest. But when the monks reviewed the footage, they noticed something impossible. The figure cast no shadow, even in the areas where the light was brightest, where every object and person should have created a clear silhouette. The figure moved through the space as if it did not exist in the physical world. The monks also noticed that the figure always stopped near the incense altar, standing in the same position, head bowed, hands clasped, and that it remained there for hours, unmoving, until the first light of dawn began to filter through the screens. Then, without warning, it would vanish, disappearing between one frame and the next, as if it had never been there at all. The footage was shared with paranormal investigators, who analyzed it extensively, and while some dismissed it as a technical glitch or a deliberate hoax, others believed it was genuine, evidence of a presence that defied explanation. The investigators visited the temple and set up additional equipment, hoping to capture more data, and during their stay, several of them reported experiencing the same unease that visitors had described, a heaviness in the air, a sense of being watched, and a faint sound like whispers that seemed to come from the walls themselves. The origins of the hollow-faced priest remain a mystery. The monks searched the temple's records, looking for any mention of a death or tragedy that might explain the sightings, but they found nothing conclusive. There were references to monks who had died on the grounds over the centuries, as was natural for such an old institution, but none of the deaths were unusual or violent, and none matched the timeline of the sightings. Some researchers propose that the figure might not be tied to a specific individual, but rather to the space itself, a manifestation of accumulated grief or suffering that had been absorbed by the temple over its long history. Others suggested that the hollow face was symbolic, a representation of emptiness or loss, a spirit that had been stripped of identity and purpose, left to wander in a state of eternal incompletion. The whispers, according to this theory, were the voices of others who had been drawn into the void, souls that had looked too deeply and become trapped, their pleas echoing from within the darkness. The idea was chilling, and it resonated with many who had encountered the figure, who said they felt not just fear, but a profound sadness when they looked into the hollow, as if they were witnessing something unbearably tragic. The monks eventually decided to limit access to the area near the incense altar, cordoning it off during certain hours and posting signs warning visitors not to linger. The sightings decreased, but they did not stop entirely. People still reported seeing the figure, sometimes in the main hall, sometimes in the gardens, always with that same hollow face and that same oppressive presence. One visitor, a filmmaker from Tokyo, said he saw the priest standing beneath a cherry tree at dusk, and that when he lifted his camera to record, the device malfunctioned, the screen going black, the battery draining instantly. When he looked up, the figure was gone, but he felt a coldness settle over him, a sensation that lasted for hours, even after he left the temple grounds. The hollow-faced priest has become part of Kyoto's urban legends, a story whispered among travelers and locals alike, a warning to those who visit the old temples to be mindful, to respect the spaces they enter, and to never stare too long into the darkness. The temple continues to operate, welcoming visitors and maintaining its traditions, but the area near the incense altar remains a place of unease, a reminder that some mysteries cannot be solved, and some presences cannot be banished. The monks say prayers for the figure, whoever or whatever it is, hoping to bring it peace, but the sightings continue and the whispers persist, urging those who hear them to look deeper, to step closer, to cross the threshold into the void. And those who do, those who give in to the compulsion, often find that the void does not let go, that it follows them home, appearing in mirrors and shadows, a hollow space that watches and waits, patient and eternal, for the moment when they are alone and vulnerable enough to be drawn in completely. I hope you enjoyed these stories. Tomorrow we will be uploading another terrifying story. Feel free to subscribe and put on your notifications to never miss another scary video. I upload almost every day. Wish you all the best. But as disturbing as that encounter was, it pales in comparison to what hunters and villagers face in the remote forests of Sabah, where the horror is not a figure that appears and disappears, but a creature that changes, that sheds and steals and becomes. Deep in the jungle, where the trees grow so thick that sunlight barely touches the ground, there is something that peels away its own skin and walks freely in the darkness, mimicking the voices of those you love, calling you deeper into the undergrowth, where it waits with patience and hunger that knows no end. In the dense rainforests of Sabah, on the island of Borneo, the indigenous communities have lived for generations in harmony with the land, hunting and gathering, respecting the boundaries of the natural world. They know the sounds of the jungle, the calls of the animals, the rustle of leaves in the wind, and they can tell, with near certainty, when something is wrong. There is a story they tell, passed down through the generations, about a creature that does not belong to the natural order, something that exists in the spaces between neither fully human nor fully beast. They call it the skinwalker, and they say it moves through the forest after midnight, its body stripped of flesh, a glistening red mass of muscle and sinew that crawls through the undergrowth with a speed and silence that defies belief. The creature is said to peel off its own skin before it hunts, hanging the discarded flesh on tree branches like a grotesque trophy, and in this skinless form it is free to move without hindrance, to slip through spaces too small for a human body, to climb and crawl and pursue with relentless determination. But the most terrifying aspect of the skinwalker is not its appearance, but its voice. It can mimic human speech perfectly, copying the tone, the cadence, the inflection of anyone it has heard, and it uses this ability to lure victims into the forest, calling out in the voices of loved ones, friends, family members, anyone who might compel you to follow. Those who answer the call, who venture into the darkness to find the source of the voice, are never seen again. Or if they are, they return changed, their minds broken, their bodies bearing wounds that cannot be explained. The villagers say the creature wears the skins it collects, draping them over its raw, exposed body until the sun rises, and that it discards them when it is done, leaving them crumpled and empty, like discarded clothing to rot in the humid air. The legend of the skinwalker is ancient, older than the oldest members of the community can remember, but sightings have continued into the modern era, reported not only by villagers, but by hunters, researchers, and tourists who have ventured too deep into the forest without proper guidance. The stories are remarkably consistent, describing a creature that is both familiar and alien, humanoid in shape, but wrong in every detail. Witnesses say the skinless form is difficult to look at, that the exposed muscle glistens wetly in the moonlight, and that the creature's movements are fluid and unnatural, as if its joints bend in ways that human anatomy does not allow. Some say it walks upright when it wants to, but that it prefers to crawl, its long limbs propelling it forward with disturbing speed, its fingers digging into the earth with each step. The creature's face, or what serves as its face, is a nightmare, a skull-like structure with no lips, no eyelids, just empty sockets that somehow still convey a sense of awareness, of intelligence. Those who have seen it up close say the worst part is the silence, that despite its speed and the violence of its movements, the creature makes almost no sound, just a faint wet sliding noise, as its body moves through the leaves and mud. The only time it makes noise is when it speaks, and when it does, the voice is perfect, so convincing that even those who know better find themselves hesitating, wondering if perhaps it really is their friend or family member calling for help. The first well-documented encounter with the skinwalker in recent history occurred in the late 1980s, when a group of hunters from a small village near the Crocker Range went into the forest to track wild boar. The group consisted of 4 men, all experienced hunters who knew the terrain well, and they set out at dawn, expecting to return by evening. As the day wore on, they moved deeper into the forest than they had originally planned, following the trail of a particularly large boar that they believed would provide enough meat to feed several families. By late afternoon, they realized they had lost the trail, and they decided to head back before it grew too dark to navigate safely. But as they retraced their steps, one of the men, a hunter named Jafar, heard a voice calling his name. He stopped, listening, and the others stopped with him. The voice was faint but clear, and it sounded like his younger brother Malik, who had stayed behind in the village. The voice called out again, more urgently this time, saying Jafar's name and asking for help. Jafar's companions urged him to ignore it, reminding him that Malik was back in the village, that there was no way he could be in the forest. But Jafar was not convinced. He said the voice sounded too real, too desperate, and that he could not leave without checking. Against the advice of the others, he moved toward the source of the voice, calling out to Malik and asking where he was. The voice responded, "Always just ahead, always out of sight," leading Jafar deeper into the undergrowth. His companions followed reluctantly, their unease growing with each step, and after several minutes, they found something that made them stop. Hanging from a low branch, draped over the bark like a wet cloth, was a piece of skin, human in shape, with arms and legs and a face that was slack and empty. The sight was so disturbing that two of the men turned and ran immediately, their fear overriding their loyalty to Jafar. The remaining hunter, a man named Ismail, grabbed Jafar's arm and tried to pull him back, but Jafar shook him off, insisting that they needed to find Malik. That is, when they heard the voice again, and this time it was different. It was still Malik's voice, but the tone had changed, becoming darker, more mocking, and it said Jafar's name with a slowness that made his blood run cold. Ismail saw it first, a shape moving through the trees low to the ground, its body glistening red in the dim light. He screamed and bolted, and Jafar finally understood. He ran, crashing through the forest, his heart pounding, and behind him he could hear the creature pursuing, its movements fast and fluid, accompanied by the wet sound of its body sliding over the undergrowth. Jafar did not stop running until he reached the edge of the village, and even then he collapsed, gasping for breath, his body shaking uncontrollably. Ismail arrived moments later, equally terrified, and the two of them told the elders what they had seen. A search party was organized, but when they returned to the area where the skin had been hanging, they found nothing. No skin, no tracks, no sign that anything had been there at all. Jafar and Ismail were questioned extensively, and while some believed their story, others thought they had been drinking or had eaten something that caused hallucinations. But the two men knew what they had seen, and they refused to go back into that part of the forest ever again. Over the years, other hunters reported similar experiences. They would hear voices calling to them, voices of people they knew, and when they followed, they would find skins hanging from the trees, fresh and wet, as if they had just been removed. Some hunters claimed to have seen the creature itself, describing the same glistening, skinless form, the same unnatural movements, and the same terrible mimicry. One man said he heard his wife's voice calling to him from the forest while he was setting traps near the village boundary, and when he went to investigate, he found a skin draped over a fallen log, the face recognizable as his wife's, though when he returned to the village, his wife was there, alive and confused by his panic. Another hunter said he heard his son's laughter echoing through the trees, and when he followed the sound, he found a skin hanging from a branch, small and child-sized, and he ran without looking back, certain that if he stayed, he would see the creature wearing it. The sightings were not limited to hunters. Villagers who lived on the edge of the forest reported hearing voices at night, calls for help, or cries of distress that seemed to come from just beyond the tree line. Some claimed to have seen figures moving in the darkness, shapes that walked upright, but moved too quickly, too smoothly, to be human. One woman said she woke in the middle of the night to the sound of her mother's voice calling her name, and when she looked out the window, she saw a figure standing at the edge of the clearing, its body glistening in the moonlight, its arms hanging too long at its sides. She closed the shutters and did not look out. Again, and in the morning, she found muddy footprints on the ground beneath her window, large and elongated, with claw-like marks where the toes should have been. The most harrowing account came from a group of campers in 2012. a mix of locals and tourists who had hired a guide to take them deep into the forest for a multi-day trek. The group set up camp near a river, and as night fell, they gathered around the fire, sharing stories and enjoying the serenity of the jungle. Around midnight, one of the tourists, a man from Australia, heard his girlfriend's voice calling to him from the trees. He looked around the fire and saw that she was sitting right there, talking to the guide, and he laughed, thinking he had imagined it. But then he heard it again, clearer this time, and his girlfriend's voice said his name and asked him to come help her. The man stood, confused, and his girlfriend looked at him, asking what was wrong. He said he heard her voice in the forest, and she shook her head, saying she had not called to him. The guide, an older man who had been leading treks for decades, went pale. He told the group to stay close to the fire, to ignore any voices they heard, and to not, under any circumstances, go into the forest alone. The tourists were unnerved but complied, and for a while everything was quiet. Then another voice called out, this time mimicking the guide's son, a young man who lived in the village. The guide's expression hardened, and he said they needed to leave, that they were not safe. The group packed quickly, their movements frantic, and as they prepared to go, they heard more voices, a chorus of calls that echoed through the trees, each one mimicking someone in the group. The Australian man heard his mother's voice. Another tourist heard her husband, and the guide heard his wife. The voices were pleading, desperate, and it took every ounce of willpower for the group to ignore them. As they hurried back toward the trail, one of the tourists, a woman from Singapore, glanced back and screamed. She said she saw a figure crawling toward them, its body low to the ground, its limbs moving in a jerking, insect-like rhythm, and draped over its back was a skin, fresh and dripping, that looked disturbingly like the guide's son. The guide did not turn around. He urged the group to run, and they did, stumbling through the darkness, their flashlights cutting wild arcs through the trees. They did not stop until they reached the village, and when they arrived, the guide immediately went to his son's house, needing to confirm that he was safe. The son was there, asleep and unharmed, but the guide said he could not shake the image of the skin draped over the creature's back, could not forget the way it had looked so real, so perfect. The creature's behavior suggested a level of intelligence that went beyond animal instinct. It seemed to understand human relationships, to know which voices would be most compelling, which calls would be hardest to ignore. Some researchers who studied the reports proposed that the skinwalker was not a supernatural entity, but a highly evolved predator, something that had adapted to hunt humans by exploiting their social bonds and their instinct to help those in need. Others believed it was something older, a spirit or demon from indigenous mythology that had taken physical form, a manifestation of the forest's darkest aspects. The villagers did not care about the explanations. They knew the creature was real, that it hunted at night, and that it was patient, willing to wait for the perfect moment to strike. They taught their children never to answer voices in the forest, never to follow sounds that seemed out of place, and never ever to go into the jungle alone after dark. The elders performed rituals meant to protect the village, placing charms and talismans at the boundaries, and they warned outsiders not to venture too deep, not to ignore the stories, because the stories, they said, were not just folklore, they were survival. The skinwalker remains a fixture of Saba's darkest legends, a creature that exists in the liminal spaces between myth and reality, seen by enough people to be believed, but never captured, never fully understood. Hunters who have spent their lives in the forest say they can feel it sometimes, a presence watching from the shadows, waiting for someone to make a mistake, to wander too far, to answer a voice that should not be there. They say the creature is ancient, that it has been hunting in those forests for longer than anyone can remember, and that it will continue to hunt long after the current generation is gone. The skins it leaves behind are found occasionally, crumpled and rotting, and those who see them say the sight is deeply unsettling, a reminder that the boundary between human and monster is thinner than we like to believe. The creature does not kill indiscriminately. It chooses its victims carefully, selecting those who are vulnerable, those who are alone, those who are desperate enough to believe that the voice they hear is real. And once it has you, once you have followed the call into the darkness, there is no escape. The villagers say that those who are taken by the skinwalker are never the same, that even if they return, they come back hollow, their eyes empty, their minds broken by whatever they witnessed in the creature's embrace. Some do not return at all, their bodies found days or weeks later, stripped and mutilated, left in places where they will be found as a warning. The skinwalker does not hide its work. It wants to be known, wants to be feared, because fear is part of its power, part of the way it controls the forest and the people who live within it. And so the stories continue, whispered in the darkness, passed from parent to child, a reminder that the jungle is not a safe place, that there are things that move in the shadows, things that peel away their skin, and walk in forms that should not exist, things that call to you in the voices of the people you love, and that if you answer, if you follow, you will become just another story, another warning, another skin hanging from a branch, waiting for the creature to wear it when the sun goes down. I hope you enjoyed these stories. Tomorrow we will be uploading another terrifying story. Feel free to subscribe and put on your notifications to never miss another scary video. I upload almost every day. Wish you all the best.